The Falcons' plans to add a new quarterback this offseason revolve around them choosing from one of three buckets: a new starter, a bridge, or a new backup.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Locked On Falcons, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the number one sports podcast network in the galaxy. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. The winter games are on, and there's no better way to follow them than with a bet on FanDuel. FanDuel, play your game. So if you don't know me, I'm your humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Sirius Black. Been covering the Atlanta Falcons for 20 years, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong here on Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. And on today's daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, we are talking all about the Falcons' offseason quarterback plans and options. We're going to outline some of those options, which will be focusing on the three buckets that we believe that the Falcons are most likely going to choose from, and most, if not all, of their potential options at quarterback to come and join Michael Penix here in Atlanta in 2026 come and fit in one of those three buckets. One of those buckets does include re-signing Kirk Cousins. We'll explain that later. So when we talk about these three buckets, and we're going to give mostly an overview on today's episode as opposed to doing a super deep dive, but at a later date, as we look to fill the time between now and the start of the league year, we're almost exactly a month away from the legal tampering period, from beginning on March 9th and the league year starting on March 11th. We'll be talking quite a bit about the quarterback. This is not going to be the first nor the last, or this is going to be the first, I guess, but not the last conversation talking about the quarterback. And we're going to focus on these three buckets, but at a later point, we might need to be like, oh, well, there's a fourth bucket, and it's probably going to be a bucket that, doesn't really fit for, the miscellaneous bucket, where it's just like, oh, these guys don't really fit in one of the other previous three buckets. But for now, we're going to sort of call them the three Bs, although we're workshopping one of the Bs, right? The first bucket is the blue chip bucket. The second bucket is the bridge bucket, and the third bucket is the backup bucket. And again, we welcome all your feedback here, whether you want to leave a comment here on YouTube, you want to send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com, an insider, Discord, whatever, your feedback. We always welcome helpful feedback. We don't appreciate the feedback that is like, Aaron, you suck, but the helpful feedback. And one of those is blue chip is the best way I can describe it, that has a B word to describe that first bucket, but after we break it down, you guys can tell me sort of if you have a better name for that bucket. But this is kind of similar to the conversation, to give this overview of the conversation we had 2 years ago about the Falcons quarterback plans, where we kind of outlined it as plan A, B, C, and D at the outset of that 2024 offseason. And for those of you that were not everydayers back then, or just need a little bit of a refresher course, it was a little bit easier to kind of outline that whole situation because it was very clear that the Falcons were going to move in a very different direction at the quarterback position, with the, outset of Raheem Morris's regime here in Atlanta back at the beginning of 2024 than where they had been the three previous years under Arthur Smith, where it was just kind of like, we'll figure it out. We're making it up as we go. And one of the things we talked about with Raheem Morris was he was likely to come in here with a clear-cut plan at the quarterback position. But, basically we had plan A, which was probably the least likely of the plans, but it was probably the most favorable plan, which was trading up for one of the big three quarterbacks in that 2024 draft: Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, and Drake May. As we discussed then, it was unlikely to do that. And for the most part, plan A looks like it has lived up to the hype in terms of this is probably going to be your best long-term solution with all three of those quarterbacks at some point in the last 2 years, sort of delivering on the hype and leading their teams deep into the postseason. Obviously, Drake May to the Super Bowl, Jaden Daniels to the NFC Championship game as a rookie. And, Caleb Williams was, one or two drives away from leading the Bears to the NFC Championship this past offseason. But, for various reasons, because of the potential upside of those three guys, we did not think any of those three teams picking at the top of the draft would move off of those spots. And so it led to the more likely outcome of plan B, which was Kirk Cousins. That was how we outlined it. And we basically said that Kirk Cousins was likely to be the Falcons' bet at the position because, again, it was in contrast to Arthur Smith. You wanted to have much more of a sure thing at that quarterback position. And while Kirk Cousins coming off his Achilles injury at his age was by no means a sure thing, he was as good a bet the Falcons could make given his history and success in a McVay-Shanahan offense, his history with Raheem Morris, and the fact that at least at that point in his career, he was a proven, winner, maybe overly strong a word, but a quarterback that could keep you in playoff contention year after year. And so that made a lot of sense for the Falcons to bet on Kirk Cousins. But the real issue with, plan B was, would he leave Minnesota? Now, we talked to Locked On Vikings at that time, Luke Braun, host of Locked On Vikings, Luke Braun, and he basically explained the Vikings are likely to take their off-ramp off of Kirk Cousins and he will become available, but we didn't know that. And basically until that Monday morning on March 11th, I believe it was, when the tampering period began and the Falcons secured, we didn't know if Kirk Cousins was going to go back to Minnesota. We thought he would leave Minnesota, but we've all the Vikings people that we talked to, were basically betting that Kirk had played his last snap in Minnesota, but we didn't know that for sure. And if Kirk didn't become available, that would mean the Falcons would pivot to plan C. And plan C is where we got it right, but we got it wrong. We got it really wrong and we got it really right, right? Plan C was, okay, well, if Kirk doesn't leave Minnesota and you don't trade up, plan C is you just take the fourth best quarterback at pick number 8. Now, we operated for that whole time thinking, oh, that's going to be J.J. McCarthy, because if you're going to take another quarterback in the top 10, it's going to be J.J. McCarthy, the consensus QB4 in that draft. We were very, very wrong that for the Falcons, that player was actually Michael Penix. But we were right in the sense of the Falcons were going to really look at plan C, but we were wrong in the sense of thinking our mind was like, oh, once you checked off plan B by signing Kirk Cousins, you don't need to go to plan C. And the Falcons were like, and they went with plan C with Michael Penix. So we made a big mistake on that one, to the point that we were like, the day before the draft, like, there's no way that the Falcons are going to use a top 10 pick on a quarterback after they paid Kirk Cousins all that money. No team in the history of sports have ever done that. And Terry was like, but anyway. And then plan D was basically the situation where, oh no, everything did not go the way that we wanted it to go. If we didn't get to plan D, which was basically sign some other veteran quarterback. That was the Justin Fields bucket. That was the Russell Wilson, Baker Mayfield bucket, where it's just like, just get the best guy that's left available at that point in time. And so we're kind of doing a similar thing, but because it's not as clear cut with this new regime coming in and what exactly they want, the sort of assumption that we're having is they're going to make a bet on one of these 3 buckets. And that bucket, again, the blue chipper, that bucket number 1, right? And we'll give an example of a pass in recent Falcon that illustrates the Falcons have dabbled with these buckets over the last couple of off seasons. And so they may do it again. It's just hopefully this time it'll work, right? But that bucket number 1, that's the Kirk Cousins bucket. This is the guy that is probably going to be our QB1 moving forward, as opposed to Michael Penix being that QB1, right? This is the bucket where it's like, we're trying to win and we're going to go out there and expend the resources where this new guy it's going to be his job to lose rather than Penix's job to lose. The bucket number 2 is that bridge quarterback. And this is the Marcus Mariota bucket, where it's just like, this is really the guy that we're just adding to keep us competitive. He's not going to make waves because we're eventually going to pivot to Michael Penix. Penix is still QB1. But this guy might have to be QB1 for a couple of months, during the offseason, during training camp, in the beginning of the season, before Penix is ready to come back. That's the bridge bucket, and that's the Mariota bucket. And then the third bucket is the Taylor Heineke bucket. This is the backup bucket. This is the guy that's really brought in to be the QB2. He's here to really, service or help Michael Penix as that QB2, right? If he has to play, he can play. But our plan moving forward is not for this guy to be our answer for any significant amount of time this upcoming season. And he's really here to be the QB2 behind Michael Penix. And the minute we get the opportunity to pivot towards Penix, we are absolutely taking that pivot. And so we'll continue the conversations breaking down that first bucket. That will allow us to briefly talk about the potential of Kirk Cousins' return, as well as Kirk Cousins' potential retirement in terms of Kirk's options. I think this first bucket is the least likely bucket that the Falcons will pick in, but we'll break down why as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So the winter games are officially here, and if you're anything like me, you're looking at these events and you're excited to see these events in the Winter Olympics that are on the biggest stage that you only get every 4 years. It's why following the Winter Games on FanDuel makes a lot of sense, whether it's medal counts or individual events or finding your angle on the sports that you care about most. FanDuel is going to give you more ways to stay connected to the action. And we know since it's the Olympics, there's going to be lots of drama, lots of intensity, and whether you're an expert on some of these events like curling or speed skating or hockey, or you're like me and you're just like, it's all about, what they look like. I'm here to be entertained because I know next to nothing about some of these sports. These niche events become must watch when you're fully locked into the competition, and FanDuel is going to help you do so. Whether you're rooting for the home country or you just love an underdog story, FanDuel is going to keep the entire Olympic experience engaging from start to finish. So the Winter Games are on, and there's no better way to follow them than with FanDuel. FanDuel, play your game. So before we get into the first bucket, I want to plug the Everydayer Club. We thank each and every one of you that makes the Locked On Falcons podcast your first listen each and every day. You are the reason why Locked On is the #1 sports podcast network in the galaxy. And you can level up your everydayerness by joining the Everydayer Club at the link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com for $5 a month or $50 a year. You get some perks, including an ad-free version of Locked On Falcons. So if you're tired of hearing all these ads, go check it out at the link in the description below. So when we talk about bucket number one, and I got to give a disclaimer, about this conversation. Again, this is not meant to be a comprehensive look at every candidate that fits into these buckets. It's just meant to be a general overview so that you get the gist of these buckets, so that as we go through the next 4 weeks, when we start talking about specific candidates, we can say, okay, this guy fits in this bucket. You get what I'm saying. So bucket number one, again, is that blue chip bucket. And again, I don't like to use the blue chip because I don't think it's a truly accurate description of what we're getting. We're still workshopping that. And again, I welcome your feedback for a better name that starts with a B than blue chip. But in the sense, it's the best way to basically describe this guy is going to be the new QB1, right? And the reason why this guy is going to be the new QB1, because if you're shopping in this bucket, you're probably likely to expend a certain amount of resources to acquire this guy. That means you're basically saying this is plan A rather than Penix being plan A, and Penix is actually plan B, right? And some of the best examples of the guys that fit in this bucket are Kirk Cousins, Malik Willis, and Mac Jones. And again, this is the bucket where we say he's probably the guy, right? And we say probably because we can't really say he's definitely the guy, because those guys aren't typically available where you're like, oh, this guy is definitely your answer at quarterback, right? Because if they're available, it probably means that people have questions about them, right? Because we know that established good quarterbacks that are definitely the guy rarely change teams and rarely become available. So when we talk about Kirk Cousins, and again, we'll do a deeper dive specifically on Kirk Cousins and his potential return probably later, potentially as early as tomorrow, depending on how, these things go. But kind of touched upon this on the Falcon squad on Monday, where if you're going to keep Kirk, it's not going to be for him to be QB2. It's going to be because you've made assurances that Kirk is going to be QB1. And right, that's really the only circumstance where I can imagine Kirk Cousins returning, right? And a lot of those assurances will come in the form of guaranteed money, right? And we saw last year the going rate for that sort of high-end veteran bridge quarterback was $10 to $15 million. That's the range that Aaron Rodgers and Daniel Jones and Russell Wilson signed. When you added up all the incentives in Joe Flacco's contract, I think it was like a $4 or $5 million deal that added like $10 million in incentives on that deal. And, my expectation is Kirk is going to want a little bit more money than, $10 to $15 million at this point, but he'll probably take what he can get. If he gets those assurances, whether it's from the Falcons or another team, that he is their QB1 in terms of, let's say $15 million fully guaranteed. But again, I'm assuming that Kirk and his representation is probably looking for more like $20, $25 million a year. So we'll see on that front. But, I've sat here, especially going into the Senior Bowl, feeling like, oh, like this is a viable option for the Falcons. This is a legit option for Kirk Cousins. And, one of the benefits of going to the Senior Bowl that, I would argue was more valuable than watching football players practice, just my personal opinion, is some of the conversations you have with other people, whether they cover the Falcons or they cover the league or they cover other teams around there. It's a great networking place. And you always come out of the Senior Bowl with little nuggets of information that always make you go like, oh, okay, this is different. And one of those nuggets of information, again, going into the week, I'm like, oh, I think Kirk, wants to play, is going to get an opportunity to play potentially here in Atlanta. And coming out of the Senior Bowl week, it's like, I think retirement is a legit option for Kirk and maybe the most likely outcome for Kirk, as opposed to, coming back to Atlanta or signing with another team, right? Some of the conversations I had in Mobile, as well as watching Kirk on his Super Bowl media tour sponsored by Great Clips. It does feel like him retiring and going into broadcast, if he doesn't get that option. And we talked about this a little bit with Jarvis Davis, I believe, last week on the podcast. If he doesn't get those assurances and he doesn't get the type of money that he gets, I think Kirk will happily hang it up and start the second phase of his career, which will probably be working for CBS or one of the other major football broadcast companies. So that is an option, but we can explore that deeper, as things roll along. Let's talk a little bit about Malik Willis. And I know a lot of people have, Jarvis included, have kind of framed Malik Willis as this high-end backup, and I don't really see that. I think the market, and maybe this changes as we roll closer over the next month, but I think the market's going to be very robust for Malik Willis. That someone's going to sign him with the intention that he's going to be their QB1 entering, training camp and potentially and presumably the season. And I think he's kind of this year's Justin Fields, who signed a $20 million a year contract last year with the Jets. And that's, QB1 money. It's low end QB1 money, but that is like, you're our guy. And this is the point where we'll note that I think there's going to be about 8 teams right now in the NFL that have current question marks in terms of who their QB1 is going to be week 1. That's Arizona, Atlanta, Cleveland, Indianapolis, Miami, Minnesota, the Jets, and Pittsburgh. You could technically throw Las Vegas as the 9th team, but we all know who's their QB1 is going to be week 1. That's going to be Fernando Mendoza. But obviously we don't, I say we all know that, but it's like 96% probability, but there's a 4% chance that they don't know. So we'll see. But, I figure one of those 8 teams is going to try to lure Malik Willis to be their starter. And the most recent rumor I've seen over at ESPN from folks like Jeremy Fowler and whatnot is that Arizona and Miami, particularly if they can pivot off of Tua and or Kyler, will be, potentially those options for Malik Willis. And basically, I don't see Malik Willis as a high-end backup because he could be a backup anywhere. And if Atlanta is going to lure him over any of the other 31 teams that, in theory, could try to sign Malik Willis as their backup, they have to offer him a little bit more than just, hey, QB2 with a pay raise. And so that, to me, is what leads to the possibility that the Falcons are going after Malik Willis this offseason, which is an option. It's going to be for him to be a QB1, even if he's not necessarily guaranteed to keep that job long term. Obviously on-field performance still ultimately is going to decide that. But Malik Willis is young enough. He's going to be 27, I believe, this offseason, where you can look at the upside and untapped potential that he has, that if you sign him, you're signing him to try to tap into that untapped and upside. And that's not, oh, we're going to sign him, he's going to start 3 games and then we're going to pivot to Michael Penix, right? You want to see if he can be your long-term answer at the quarterback position if things break a certain way. And so, he's one of those higher ceiling guys that I think is why he's in bucket number 1. Now with Mac Jones, similar to Willis, you're looking more at the upside, right? Mac Jones is going to be 28 in September. He's coming off his best year since his rookie season in New England, where he led the Patriots to the playoffs, but the 49ers aren't going to give him away, right? Jacksonville was able to acquire him from the Patriots 2 years ago for a 6th-round pick. It's going to take a lot more than that to get him out of San Francisco. The rumors I've heard is 2nd-round pick, a 3rd-round pick plus, meaning probably you got to throw in another day 3 pick into the mix with that 3rd-round pick to basically make it 2nd-round value. Because we know the 49ers really value their QB2s, right? When you look at the 2 seasons that the 49ers have had their QB1 stay healthy from start to finish, it was 2019, it was 2023. Is it a coincidence that those were the 2 years that the 49ers have gone to the Super Bowl, right? And so if they're going to trade their backup quarterback, it's, the backup quarterback is going to basically make or break their season is basically the point I'm trying to make, which is, 5 out of, the last 7-8 years or whatever, that backup quarterback is going to have to play significant snaps, and that's going to make or break their season. So if you're going to trade a second round pick for Mac Jones or a third round pick plus, you're basically saying he's your QB1 now. And you're probably going to extend Mac Jones with a new contract extension that represents that, similar to the price tag that we're talking about with Malik Willis. It may be low-end quarterback one money, but it's going to be quarterback one money. So that to me kind of is the overview of bucket number one, which we're calling the blue chip bucket. Again, welcome all your helpful feedback on coming up with a better B word to describe that bucket. But let's talk about the second bucket, which is the bridge guys. And if I was a betting man, I would say this is the bucket that the Falcons are more likely to shop in than bucket number one. And this includes a couple of names of some quarterbacks that people have been clamoring for here in Atlanta for the last several off seasons. And it may finally be the time that we land Justin Fields and or Jacoby Brissett, and we'll break down why as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So wouldn't it be nice if you were doing your taxes and it was just as easy as handing the ball off to Bijan Robinson? And with TurboTax Full Service, you can hand off your taxes to a local tax expert and not have to stress from start to finish, just like you don't have to stress when you give that rock to Bijan. Instead of spending hours trying to figure out forms, you can meet with a local TurboTax expert in person or connect online. They're going to handle everything from your W-2s to your self-employment forms. They're going to work to get you every deduction. All you got to do is upload your documents, go about your day, and get updates right in the TurboTax app. It's going to be a huge time saver. It's going to give you peace of mind knowing an expert is handling, just like an expert running back is handling the rock with Bijan Robinson. So for a limited time, get your taxes done by a local TurboTax expert for just $150, all in. If a TurboTax expert didn't file for you last year, just file by February 28th. Take taxes off your plate and get back to your life by visiting turbotax.com/local to book your appointment today. So bucket number two is the bridge bucket. This is the Mariota bucket. These are kind of the high floor guys in contrast to the bucket number one. Now, obviously, Kirk Cousins is more of a high floor than a high ceiling guy. But because of Kirk Cousins and all the other stuff that is involved with Kirk Cousins, you're putting him in the high ceiling bucket, even though that's not describing him. But this is more the bucket number two, that is of the high floor guys that lack the ceiling to be the long-term options, like a Jones does, like a Willis does, right? This is a bucket full of 30-plus-year-old guys, all past their prime. Joe Flacco, Jacoby Brissett, Jimmy Garoppolo, Gardner Minshew, Mitchell Trubisky are some of the guys in this bucket. These are all guys that have started around 50-plus games. Now, Minshew is only at the low end of this group at 47. Everybody else is 50-plus. Flacco is over 200. And it means basically you're comfortable with these guys starting games. We talked about this yesterday with the reclamation process. It's about 50 starts that a guy can make before you're like, okay, he's good. Good in the sense of not good in the sense of like he's a good quarterback, good in the sense of he understands what defenses are doing, so he's not going to be tricked like a young quarterback is, right? And so these are the guys that you're fine giving starting snaps in the offseason, in training camp, and going into the season if need be, should Penix not be ready for a week one. That's the case, but there's no part of you that goes like this is beyond more than a one-year bridge, right? It's the same exact scenario the Falcons had in 2022 with Marcus Mariota, although I got in a lot of arguments with some folks that were big fans of Marcus Mariota that, insisted that Mariota was the long-term answer of the team. And that's where the AKA Serious Black name came from, because it was like, we're serious on this podcast, and you can't be serious if you think Marcus Mariota is the long-term answer at the quarterback position for the Atlanta Falcons in the summer of 2022. And there is another quarterback in this group that isn't 30-plus, that's much younger than that. That's Justin Fields, right? But his flaming out in New York means that I don't think he fits in that first quote-unquote high upside, high ceiling bucket. Right, you're not going to really sell anybody that Justin Fields has QB1 upside after the 2025 season that he just had. But Fields is currently under contract for the Jets, so they would need to cut him for him to be available. But just like Jacoby Brissett, he is also under contract for the Cardinals, and he would also need to be cut, potentially traded as well. And Jacoby Brissett's fate is tied to Kyler Murray's future. Now, Fields, I would be shocked if Fields is not cut by the Jets in some form or fashion. There's a world where Jacoby Brissett is kept by the Cardinals. A lot of it will depend on Kyler Murray's future. We talked about this on the Falcon squad on Monday, that I kind of feel like Jacoby Brissett is the perfect bridge option for this specific team because he has been the bridge option for these specific coaches in the past. He did it in 2022 with Kevin Stefanski in Cleveland when Deshaun Watson was suspended at the beginning of that year, and he did it again in 2024 for Alex Van Pelt, the Falcons' current quarterbacks coach, then the New England Patriots offensive coordinator when they drafted Drake May. And so, we can speak about, Brissett's potential availability down the road, but it is to me notable that both Fields and Brissett are guys that at various points over the last few years have been very popular amongst Falcon fans and everydayers as the guys that you have wanted for the Falcons to add at quarterback instead of some of the other alternative options that they've chosen. With Justin Fields, that was obviously 2021 draft as well as the 2024 offseason when the Falcons signed Kirk Cousins. And with Jacoby Brissett specifically, it was that 23 offseason when the Falcons opted for Taylor Heineke to be the QB2 behind Desmond Ridder. And then again in 2024, instead, Brissett went to New England and the Falcons went with Kirk Cousins. And so we'll do a deeper dive on a lot of these bucket 2 guys because, again, I think this is probably the bucket that the Falcons are going to be shopping in this offseason. If I was to bet at this point in time, again, we'll see how things change over the coming weeks. But that's kind of more of a general overview of these guys, and we'll sort of see. But just because the Falcons, I think, want to be in these first 2 buckets doesn't mean that they're guaranteed to be in these first 2 buckets because it's not really up to them. It takes 2 to tango when it comes to free agency, especially. And not every team is going to want to be, or not every player is guaranteed to want to play for the Atlanta Falcons, right? For a variety of reasons that we'll get into later. But, that gets us to bucket number 3. And this is purely the backup bucket. This is the Taylor Heineke bucket. This is where it's like, this guy can start if I need him to start, but there's no part of us that we're having a conversation like, oh, this guy is, our long-term answer at the quarterback position. He's really just being brought in to be the QB2 here. He's an extra eyes in the quarterback room. He, similar to what Taylor Heineke was for Desmond Ridder back in 2023. He's signed primarily to be a backup to Michael Penix. And more than likely, the minute Penix is ready, you are pivoting, right? At least in bucket number 2, there's a world where if you sign Joe Flacco and you're, 2-2, in the first month of the season, and then Penix is ready to go, and it's like, oh, well, let's just write out this Joe Flacco thing and for maybe a couple more weeks and see what's what. You're not doing that with, I think, bucket number 3. And some of the examples of bucket number 3 that have connections with this coaching staff that we'll name today is Tyrod Taylor, Jake Browning, Kenny Pickett, Tyler Huntley, Case Keenum, Hendon Hooker, Trevor Siemian, a couple of other names that have connections. Josh Dobbs, you'd have to trade for him. He's currently the backup in New England. And from all I can tell is Mike Vrabel loves Josh Dobbs. He'll never part ways with Josh Dobbs willingly. So I don't know if that's a realistic trade. And then there's Tyson Bagent. I know that's another trade that people have been talking about. I don't think the Bears are likely to unload him because that would mean they would have to find a replacement for him. But maybe you can make it worth their while with the right draft compensation. But, I don't think the Falcons want to be in this bucket. Right. It's similar to kind of when we talked about plans A through D. This is kind of the plan D bucket, right? Like, A through C is like, when we talk about A through C, it's like, okay, you can look at any of the plans A, B, or C and be like, okay, this makes sense to me. Right. Once you get to plan D, it's like, well, we're just here because we weren't able to execute on plans A through C. And that's kind of what bucket 3 is. It's like, well, buckets 1 and 2 fell through. But there are also worlds where, you're forced to shop here, right? Because some of the options in buckets 1 and 2 are a little too expensive. They're not as available as you thought they would be. They choose other teams, right? And ultimately that may lead to the Falcons being like, no, we actually wanted to shop in bucket number 3 the entire time. And one of the reasons that is actually a legit reason is because you have conviction on Michael Penix. And I know you guys are saying, Aaron, you're not allowed to say the word conviction. It's a bad word. Based off of the Terry Fontenot experience at this point in time. And, the recent thing going on with James Pierce, where, the last thing, well, depending on who you ask, is you want conviction involving James Pierce. But, we could get to March and Michael Penix, jokes aside, Michael Penix could be trending enough in the right direction where the Falcons feel really good about his recovery. And they're like, you know what? We only need to shop in bucket number 3, not to mention the benefit of shopping in bucket number 3 is you're going to probably save a lot more money than you would save shopping in buckets number 1 and 2, right? Probably the max that you're spending on a guy from bucket number 3 is like $3 to $5 million at this point in time. and we'll sort of see if the Falcons go down that road. Again, this is not meant to be a comprehensive list of all the options available. There's going to be a bunch of available quarterbacks, or potentially available, a bunch of available quarterbacks that we did not mention today in any of these buckets. You got free agents like Russell Wilson, Trey Lance, Teddy Bridgewater, Zach Wilson, Sam Howell. You got trade or cut candidates like Kyler Murray, Tua Tagovailoa, Geno Smith, Anthony Richardson, Andy Dalton, Will Levis, and of course, Stequavius Bennett. And of course, if we're talking about buckets named after Marcus Mariota or Taylor Heineke, you in theory could go out and get the real thing, because Mariota and Heineke are currently free agents at this point in time. So, and I'm sure there are other names that we could add to this list. So we will probably talk about a lot of these guys over the next 4 weeks. And so that will be a continued conversation. Tomorrow's conversation, we might do a deep dive on Kirk Cousins. As I often say here during the offseason, we're just kind of playing it by ear on the offseason. There may be a more viable story that is worthy of discussion. Probably, and again, unless something comes up major tomorrow, we're probably not going to talk about James Pierce. There were some details on the police report that came out on Monday, so you can get some details. I know ESPN and TMZ Sports have some of those details from the police report. So if you want to get that, what we kind of outlined on Sunday in terms of the timeline and the broad strokes was pretty accurate. But if you want to get more details on the specifics of those broad strokes, then you can go check that out on those various websites. But my plan is, and again, we can only control what we can control. And so we might have to pivot off of this plan. But my plan is the next time we have a significant conversation about James Pierce is not going to be, the sort of tabloidy, here's what went down and here's what's going, it's going to be like, okay, let's stick to football. That's what we're good at here on this podcast. And what is this sort of Falcons football-based strategy that if they don't have James Pierce this upcoming season or in the future because he's suspended, because he's cut, because he's on the commissioner's exempt list, how do they replace that value? So that is my at least initial plan. The next time we talk about James Pierce, will be replacing James Pierce on the football field as opposed to all the things that are going on with James Pierce off the football field. But we'll play that by ear. We might get into, the Kirk Cousins conversation as well, potentially on tomorrow's episode. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. Check us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you want to get a recap of all the things that went right or wrong for the Patriots and Seahawks in Super Bowl 60, check out Locked On Patriots, Locked On Seahawks, as well as check out Locked On NFL to cover you for the big game, as well as all the other big stories from around the NFL. And check out the Everydayer Club in the link in the description below. $5 a month or $50 a year at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com for an ad-free version of Locked On Falcons, as well as other perks. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.